The engineers called it the Robo-Rabbit. The alligators called it lunch. What began as one of the more creative wildlife management experiments in recent American history ended, within 3 days of its launch, in a sequence of events that nobody on the research team had modeled. 12-foot alligators were destroying $4,000 robotic decoys on camera. The pythons the devices were supposed to lure had stopped showing up entirely. Millions of dollars in equipment were being consumed by the wrong predator, while the right one watched from a distance. By any conventional measure of project success, the Robotic Rabbit program was a catastrophic failure. What the team discovered inside that failure is the part of the story that actually matters. The Burmese python invasion of the Florida Everglades is one of the most thoroughly documented ecological disasters in modern American environmental history, and also one of the most resistant to every solution that has been thrown at it. 30 years of removal efforts, bounty programs, professional hunters, and technological experiments have collectively removed tens of thousands of snakes from an ecosystem that may contain 300,000 of them. The math does not work in the hunter's favor. For every python removed, the breeding population absorbs the loss and continues expanding. So when the Robotic Rabbit program ended in alligator-inflicted wreckage, it would have been reasonable to write it off as another expensive entry in a long catalog of well-intentioned failures. One data analyst on the research team looked at the wreckage differently. What he found in the footage those destroyed robots had been recording changed the entire strategic framework of the fight. This is the story of how a failed experiment accidentally became the most powerful tool humans have ever deployed against one of North America's most relentless invasive species. And it raises a question worth sitting with from the start. How many breakthroughs are hiding inside the failures that got written off too quickly? How the Everglades became a python empire. The Burmese python did not invade the Florida Everglades. It was invited, and then abandoned. And then it did what apex predators do when they find an ecosystem with abundant food and no natural enemies. It consumed everything it could reach and reproduced at a rate the ecosystem had no defense against. The origin story begins with the exotic pet trade of the 1980s and 1990s. Burmese python hatchlings were sold through pet shops across South Florida as manageable novelties, compact, visually striking, docile enough for inexperienced handlers. The element sellers consistently failed to communicate was trajectory. A python that fits in a child's hands at purchase will, within 3 to 4 years, measure 15 feet in length and possess the muscular strength to overpower a deer. Many owners discovered this reality long after the window for returning the animal to a store had closed. Their solution was the Everglades, which they treated as a place where a snake could simply be set free. Those individual releases accumulated over years. Then, in August 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida and demolished a substantial number of reptile breeding facilities near Miami, releasing an unknown additional population of pythons directly into the wetlands. The combination of deliberate releases and the Andrew escape seeded a breeding population in an ecosystem that was, from the python's perspective, functionally perfect. The Everglades offered consistent warmth, permanent water, and a prey community that had spent thousands of years evolving alongside alligators, bobcats, and Florida panthers. None of those animals had prepared the native wildlife for a 15-foot ambush constrictor that could remain motionless in 2 inches of water for hours, detect body heat in complete darkness through infrared-sensitive pit organs, and strike faster than a raccoon's nervous system could respond. The native mammals encountered pythons the way an ordinary person encounters a garden hose on the sidewalk, without the behavioral context to recognize the danger. A female Burmese python lays between 50 and 100 eggs per clutch, and incubates them with a thermal commitment more characteristic of birds than reptiles, coiling around the clutch and generating heat to maintain incubation temperature. With no predator targeting either the adults or the nests, population growth was exponential. Current estimates range between 100,000 and 300,000 animals distributed across South Florida, a population that has been expanding continuously for 3 decades. The ecological damage is measurable and severe. In the most heavily affected zones, raccoon populations have declined by more than 99%. Opossums have fallen by similar margins. Bobcat populations are down substantially. The food web that supported the Everglades' extraordinary biodiversity depended on those small and medium mammal populations as its foundation. When they collapse, the effects move upward through every dependent species. What does a predator-free paradise for an invasive species actually look like from the ecosystem's perspective? The Everglades has been providing that answer for 30 years, and the answer involves a silence that researchers who have worked there for decades describe as one of the most unsettling things they have ever experienced in a natural environment. Roads where you could not drive 100 yards in the 1980s without encountering wildlife now stretch for miles without a single animal crossing. The removal programs that did not work. Florida's official response to the python invasion has cycled through several distinct phases, and the honest assessment of each one is that it made a contribution that was meaningful relative to individual encounters and inadequate relative to the population as a whole. The Florida Python Challenge, launched in 2013 as a public hunting competition, invited anyone willing to enter the swamp to pursue pythons for cash prizes and public recognition. The 2013 event produced 68 snakes after weeks of combined effort from hundreds of participants. If the true population at that time was even 10,000 animals, that removal rate represented something close to zero. The competition had value as public engagement and media coverage. As a population management tool, it was not designed to succeed and did not. The state moved to professional contract hunters. Licensed, experienced individuals paid an hourly rate with bonuses per snake removed. These hunters developed real expertise. They learned the terrain, the timing patterns, the specific hiding behaviors that make pythons so difficult to locate. Since the program's formalization in 2017, professional contractors have removed more than 23,000 snakes. That is a genuine operational achievement. It is also, by current population estimates, likely to represent less than 10% of the total population. The breeding rate absorbs the removal rate without measurable impact on overall numbers. The Judas snake program, which involves implanting GPS trackers in sexually mature males and following their movements during breeding season to locate aggregations of females, has produced the highest per-hour yield of any technique currently deployed. Researcher Ian Bartosek of the Conservancy of Southwest Florida has used this approach to locate and remove some of the largest individual pythons ever documented. It remains insufficient at scale because the geographic expanse of the Everglades exceeds the coverage capacity of any feasible number of tracking teams. Thermal imaging drones, which work effectively on warm-blooded targets, fail against cold-blooded constrictors that closely match the ambient temperature of their environment. From above, a python lying in the sun is essentially indistinguishable from the warm ground surrounding it. The technology that works so well in other wildlife management contexts provides almost no functional advantage here. Here is what makes this particularly frustrating from a strategic standpoint. Experienced hunters who have spent years working in the Everglades have started saying something that agency managers have been reluctant to formally acknowledge. The snakes appear to be adapting. Breeding populations are concentrating in the areas of deepest cypress hammock and most impenetrable sawgrass, the zones where sustained human presence has never been established. Whether this represents genuine behavioral learning, simple survivor bias selection pressure, or both is debated. The operational implication is the same either way. The removal pressure is not keeping pace with the reproductive and adaptive capacity of the population. After years of trying approaches centered on human skill, physical effort, and conventional technology, the people running Florida's python response recognized that something fundamentally different was needed. They needed a hunter that did not use eyes, did not tire, and did not need to see the snake to find it. What the dogs proved before the robots arrived. The insight that eventually led to the robotic rabbit program came from an earlier experiment that produced a cleaner result: detection dogs. A trained detection dog operates on a sensory basis that has no human equivalent. The olfactory architecture of a working dog processes chemical information with a sensitivity that allows it to detect trace amounts of compounds at concentrations no human instrument reliably matches in the field. A Burmese python leaves a chemical trace in its environment, a faint musky scent that disperses through grass and mud and lingers for a significant period after the snake has moved on. To a human nose, that trace is undetectable. To a trained dog, it is a clear signal. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission deployed 2 trained detection dogs, a black Labrador named Truman and a Dutch Shepherd named Eleanor, into python survey areas. Both animals had been trained over months to recognize and alert on the specific chemical signature that Burmese pythons leave behind. In their first months of field deployment, the duo located multiple large pythons in areas where human survey teams had been working unsuccessfully for extended periods. Truman's working pattern in the field was consistent. The tail would stiffen, followed by a low nose tracking posture, followed by a sudden freeze that communicated exactly where the scent concentration was strongest. Moments after Eleanor froze, a handler's light would locate a python that had been effectively invisible to every prior search effort. The program worked. The dogs were genuinely effective in a way that no previous detection method had been. And the working conditions in the Everglades were brutal. Ambient temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, crushing humidity, sharp sawgrass that required protective boots for the dog's paws, and the constant presence of other dangerous animals including alligators and venomous cottonmouth snakes. The dogs wore cooling vests and required regular breaks that limited their operational hours. Even with those limitations, the detection rate compared favorably with anything the program had previously deployed. The problem was straightforward. 2 dogs cannot cover 1.5 million acres. Scaling to meaningful coverage would require hundreds of dog teams, with all the training time, handler staffing, veterinary care, and logistical support that entails. The cost projection was prohibitive. The dogs had, however, established a principle that would shape everything that followed. They proved that scent was the key variable. A python could evade sight indefinitely. It could not evade a detector calibrated to its chemical signature. If a device could replicate what the dogs were detecting, and do so at the scale that 2 dogs could not cover, the operational equation changed entirely. That line of thinking led directly to the engineering team and the question of what a mechanical rabbit would need to do to fool a Burmese python. What would you have built? If someone handed you the problem of creating a decoy that could attract a constrictor predator through darkness and dense vegetation, what combination of signals would you have tried to replicate first? The engineering of a decoy and the first 2 days. The live bait phase that preceded the robotic rabbit program established the proof of concept for prey attraction, but generated its own serious problem. Researchers placed live marsh rabbits in secured enclosures along known python travel corridors and documented pythons approaching the pens in significant numbers. The biological principle worked clearly. The sensory signals of a living prey animal drew constrictors to a specific, monitored location. The ethical dimension was less clear. Footage of distressed live rabbits surrounded by large pythons attracted the kind of immediate public reaction that tends to end funding conversations quickly. The program was shut down under sustained pressure from animal welfare organizations. The engineers who inherited the concept from the live bait team knew what the biological targets were. A Burmese python hunting at night navigates primarily through 3 sensory channels: infrared heat detection through pit organs along the jaw, chemical detection through the Jacobson's organ via tongue flicking, and vibration sensing through the lower jaw in contact with the ground. To fool a python in the dark, a decoy needed to produce a convincing output on at least the first 2 of those channels simultaneously. The device the team built addressed both. A thermal pad inside each unit maintained a surface temperature of approximately 99 degrees Fahrenheit, closely matching the body temperature of a living marsh rabbit. Chemical emitters released compounds designed to replicate the scent profile of rabbit musk, dispersible on air currents and detectable through vegetation. Some units incorporated small mechanical actuators that produced periodic ear and nose movement, adding a visual dimension for pythons operating at the edge of visibility. Each device ran on integrated solar panels for continuous multi-week operation. Inside each unit was a motion-triggered camera system connected to a wireless transmitter. Any movement within the detection radius activated the camera and sent an alert to monitoring personnel stationed at distances of several miles. 120 units were deployed across known high-density python zones at a per-unit cost of approximately $4,000. The first 48 hours were genuinely extraordinary. Alerts began arriving almost immediately after deployment. Field cameras documented adult Burmese pythons, some exceeding 15 feet in length, approaching the decoys in precisely the way the design intended. They extended their tongues to sample the air, detected the combined thermal and chemical signature, and struck. They coiled around the units in constriction behavior. Response teams moved in and made captures. The system was producing results that exceeded the team's most optimistic projections. Then day 3 arrived. The alligators, the disaster, and the secret. In the wreckage, the alert from a decoy positioned near a deep water canal came in like every other alert had. A monitor watched the camera feed expecting a python. What appeared instead was a 12-foot American alligator moving with purposeful speed toward the enclosure. The alligator was not confused about what it was approaching. It was responding to exactly the same combination of signals the pythons had been responding to: a localized heat source, a mammal-specific chemical scent, and the suggestion of a small prey animal in a contained space. From the alligator's sensory perspective, the robotic rabbit was a small, warm animal in a pen. The pen was not going to stop a 12-foot alligator. In a single explosive movement, the gator charged and closed its jaws around the $4,000 device. What emerged from that bite was not recognizable as either a rabbit or a piece of functioning equipment. This was not an isolated incident. As more alligators discovered that these locations contained warm-scented objects, they returned and brought the same result. Dozens of units were destroyed by alligator predation over the following days. The pythons, for their part, detected the sustained presence of alligators around the decoy sites and withdrew. The devices had accidentally created alligator feeding stations that repelled the species they were designed to attract. By any operational definition, the program had collapsed. Budget was being consumed by alligator jaws. Python capture rates at the decoy sites had dropped to essentially zero. Program leadership was preparing to terminate the experiment and redirect resources. One person on the team was paying attention to something different from the failure metrics. A data analyst reviewing the footage and sensor logs from the destroyed and intact units noticed that the devices had been recording something beyond what they were designed to capture. Before the alligators reached each unit, and during the weeks when units in lower traffic zones had operated without incident, the motion sensors, thermal imagers, and cameras had logged every animal that passed within detection range. Not just pythons, everything, with timestamps, temperature readings, and directional data. The complete dataset from all 120 units, cross-referenced and plotted geographically, did not resemble the random distribution that anyone managing an invasive species across a million-plus-acre wetland would expect. The pythons were not ranging freely and uniformly across the Everglades. They were moving through specific corridors, recurring pathways through the water and sawgrass that they used consistently across multiple recording sessions. The alligators were using overlapping corridors. The spatial relationship between the two species' movement patterns was structured in a way that no prior survey methodology had been able to reveal. The robotic rabbits had failed as traps. In failing, they had generated a map that nobody had been able to draw before. What the eye found in the pattern. The research team fed the complete dataset from all 120 units into a machine learning system and asked it to find structure in what they had collected. The algorithm processed movement data, timing information, temperature correlations, directional patterns, and the spatial relationships between all recorded events across the full deployment period. What it produced was not simply a map of where pythons had been detected. It was a behavioral model, a predictive framework for where specific animals were likely to be, at specific times of day and night, across specific seasonal periods. The AI had identified something the data contained that the human analysts had not been positioned to see. The python movement patterns were not random. They were structured around avoidance. The snakes were routing their movements through corridors and timing windows that minimized their exposure to alligators, their only significant natural threat in the Everglades ecosystem. Decades of coexistence with alligators in the same wetland had produced, through whatever combination of individual learning and population-level selection, a movement strategy built around avoiding the places and times where alligator activity was highest. That avoidance behavior was the pattern that gave the AI its predictive leverage. If the snakes were moving in structured ways driven by fear of a known predator, and if the algorithm could model that fear from the data the robots had recorded, then the system could forecast where individual animals would be before they arrived there. This is the pivot point, where the story changes from a failure narrative to something considerably more interesting. The robots had not located a few snakes. They had generated the data required to decode the behavioral logic of a population of hundreds of thousands of animals, and that logic had a specific weakness built into it. The thing the pythons feared had been teaching them where to go for decades, and now that routing information was in a database. Think about what this means from a predator management standpoint. The most effective surveillance system the program had ever deployed was not the one that was designed. It was the one that failed, recorded everything in the process of failing, and handed a machine learning algorithm the raw material it needed to find a pattern that no human analyst would have identified by looking at the same data manually. The hunt that followed, and what it produced, armed with the AI-generated movement model, the field teams abandoned the decoy and wait strategy entirely and replaced it with something closer to coordinated interception. Rather than positioning at known locations and hoping a python would eventually wander close enough to be captured, teams used the predictive output to identify where the AI's model indicated snakes would be, at what time, moving in what direction. They positioned on the corridors rather than waiting at fixed points. They intercepted animals in transit rather than baiting them to a stationary location. The results were immediate enough to be startling. Teams that had been finding 1 or 2 snakes per extended night patrol began locating groups. The AI's tracking of mature female movements, the individuals whose reproductive output was most consequential to population management, led teams to locations they would not have prioritized under any prior strategic framework. What they found at those locations were breeding aggregations, concentrations of adult females gathered in specific deep swamp areas that no ground survey had ever systematically reached. These were not the occasional large snake found along a levee or canal. These were nesting sites, containing dozens of mature females and, in several cases, thousands of eggs in active incubation. The removal numbers from the month following the AI integration outpaced the previous full year of the conventional bounty program. Every destroyed robotic rabbit, every dollar consumed by alligator jaws, every hour of frustration from the program's operational collapse had contributed data that the machine learning system needed to build a model that conventional field methods could not have produced independently. The war in the Everglades is not over. The python population has not been broken. No single tool, including this one, is going to reverse 30 years of unchecked population expansion across 1.5 million acres in a single season or a single year. What has changed is the strategic intelligence available to the people doing the work. They can now intercept animals on routes they did not know existed. At times, the model identifies as high probability, in areas that ground surveys without this data would deprioritize. Here is the question that should probably stay open at the end of this story, and it is a genuinely uncertain one. Does a more effective removal strategy that targets breeding females and nesting aggregations eventually change the population trajectory, or does the reproductive capacity of the remaining population simply absorb the increased pressure and continue at a pace that still outpaces the hunters? The AI map changed the fight. Whether it can change the outcome is a question the data is still in the process of answering. If you want to follow how this develops, the story from here is not less interesting than what produced the AI map. The Everglades has more chapters ahead, and the findings from the continued deployment of this approach are going to say something significant about whether machine learning-guided wildlife management can do what 30 years of conventional methods could not. Drop your own prediction in the comments. Based on everything you have just read, do you think the AI map ultimately turns the tide, or does the python population find a way to absorb even this? The larger lesson in the wreckage. The robotic rabbit program's actual legacy is not the technology it deployed. It is the principle it demonstrated, which is that the data produced by a failed experiment can be more valuable than the result the experiment was designed to produce. The engineers who built the robo-rabbit were trying to solve a luring problem. They built a device that failed comprehensively at luring and succeeded spectacularly at surveillance, not because they planned that outcome, but because the motion sensors, cameras, and transmitters inside each unit were recording everything whether or not anyone was paying attention to the specific data they were generating. The insight that turned failure into breakthrough came from someone who was willing to look at what the experiment had actually produced rather than what it had failed to produce. That reframe is not unique to wildlife biology. It appears consistently in accounts of scientific and technological breakthroughs across domains. The experiment that was designed to confirm one hypothesis generates, in failing to confirm it, the data that eventually produces an entirely different and more significant finding. The prerequisite is a researcher willing to treat failure as information rather than as a verdict. In the Everglades, that reframe produced a behavioral map of one of the most ecologically damaging invasive species on the continent, derived from the recordings of robots that alligators destroyed on camera. The map exists because the failure was documented. The failure was documented because the cameras were running. The cameras were running because someone put them inside a $4,000 robotic rabbit and deployed it in a swamp, and someone else paid enough attention to what those cameras captured, even after the program was considered a loss, to notice that the wreckage contained something the program had never been designed to find. Whether the AI-guided approach ultimately shifts the trajectory of the Florida python invasion remains to be demonstrated over time. What is already demonstrable is that the response program now has a form of strategic intelligence it did not have before, derived from an experiment it was prepared to write off entirely. The pythons are still out there. The AI map is being used against them right now. And the most important question the data is still in the process of answering is whether machine learning can accomplish what physical effort, biological tricks, and 3 decades of removal programs collectively could not. What do you think? Is data the missing ingredient that finally changes this fight, or has the python population been in the Everglades long enough that no removal strategy can realistically reverse what 30 years of unchecked breeding has produced? The answer matters not just for Florida, but for every ecosystem currently dealing with an established invasive predator. This is not an isolated problem, and whatever the Everglades teaches us about it is going to be relevant elsewhere. Stay with this story.